What happens when shea butter becomes a battlefield? It began not with drums of celebration, but with a decree whispered into the markets of the world. On the 1st of August 2025, Washington imposed a 50% tariff on Burkina Faso's most valuable natural treasure, shea butter. No warning, no negotiation, just a single stroke that threatened to silence the hands of 160,000 women whose labor had carried generations. What the West called Policy President Ibrahim Traoré called, by its truer name, economic warfare. They tax our heritage, our mothers, and the very hands that feed our children, he declared. And across Burkina Faso, the message spread like fire on dry grass. In Bobo Dioulasso, trucks stood idle. In Kaya cooperatives closed their doors. In the villages, women sat with baskets of unsold nuts, asking if tomorrow would bring food or hunger. But in the palace at Ouagadougou, a soldier-turned-statesman refused to bend. He did not plead. He pivoted. Can a single decree in Washington silence 160,000 hands? Or will it make all of Africa speak, "Stay with us," and see how God carries this story forward? Subscribe and raise your voice for an Africa that stands tall and rise. If your heart says yes, type it loud in the comments, Africa Rise. Amen. On the morning of August 1st, 2025, the news broke not with fanfare, but with a silence that pressed heavy on the air. Washington had signed a decree, a 50% tariff on shea butter from Burkina Faso. There had been no letter of intent, no roundtable discussion, not even a whisper of warning. Just a document that carried the weight of betrayal. For more than 2 decades, the shea industry had stood as one of the lifelines of Burkina Faso. Over 160,000 women worked the land, gathering the nuts, cracking shells by hand, and stirring paste through the heat of open fires. Their butter did not only soothe African skin, it traveled across oceans, filling jars and bottles that bore the logos of some of America's most cherished beauty brands. From the shelves of Brooklyn to boutiques in Los Angeles, shea had become the quiet link between African labor and Western luxury. Now, with the stroke of a pen, that bond was severed. Warehouses from Ouagadougou to Bobo Dioulasso locked their gates. Trucks stood still on highways, their barrels of raw shea hardening in the punishing sun. Cooperative leaders made frantic calls to distributors in Missouri, Florida, and Texas, but the phone lines went cold. American buyers disappeared overnight, unwilling to face the risk of sanctions. Within 48 hours, the damage was visible. Haulage volumes collapsed by 32%. Procurement offices turned dark. Women who had worked since dawn stood idle beneath neem trees, waiting for instructions that never came. In the rural town of Bulsa Amanatada, sat cross-legged in the dust, her fingers still thick with churned paste. Tomorrow, she whispered, "Will we eat or will we wait?" The ripple stretched far beyond the villages. In Bobo, the nation's central transport hub, drivers slept inside their cabs, their wages tied to journeys that would never be completed. At the Ministry of Industry, Minister Sorzerbo looked at the reports and spoke the words many feared to admit. This is not a trade dispute. This is a test of our backbone. Meanwhile, in the global marketplace, confusion reigned. Some companies rerouted their orders to Ghana and Benin, while others froze operations entirely. The London Shea Futures Index spiked by 11% as traders scrambled to hedge against a collapsing supply chain. Exporters in Lagos hesitated to sign new contracts, wary of becoming collateral in what was clearly shaping into a trade war. The silence from Washington was deafening. No press conference from the White House. No statement of clarity from trade officials. Only vague words about national interest and economic realignment. Yet, the message was unmissable. The labor of Africa, the sweat of women, the pride of a nation, all of it had been reduced to a pawn on a chessboard of power. For Burkina Faso, this was more than economics. It was survival. Shea butter was not only a product, it was identity, culture, and sustenance. The global shea market, valued at more than $2.5 billion in 2025, was expanding rapidly. But within this growth, Africa remained trapped in a pattern as old as colonialism itself, exporting raw wealth cheaply, only to buy it back at inflated prices. By branding Shea unworthy, Washington had struck not at numbers, but at dignity. And yet the story did not end with despair. In Kaya Salamata Konate, a cooperative leader gathered her team beneath the wide shade of a mango tree. She looked at the anxious faces of women who had known hardship all their lives, and she spoke not of fear, but of resolve. "They think we are just exporters," she said quietly, "but we are mothers. We are fighters." Her words echoed across the land, carried by radio, whispered in markets, repeated in homes. The tariff had been intended to break the will of a small nation. Instead, it ignited a flame, one that began in silence, but threatened to roar into defiance. This was not just a tariff. This was an assault on sovereignty. And in the palace at Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim, the soldier-turned-president, was preparing his answer. The shockwaves did not stop at Ouagadougou's palace gates. They rippled outward across oceans into boardrooms, laboratories, and store shelves. What Washington had intended as a surgical move against a small landlocked nation became within days a fracture in the global supply chain. In the United States, the consequences were immediate and uncomfortable. Cosmetic labs from Illinois to Georgia scrambled to reformulate creams and lotions that had relied for years on the rich, creamy consistency of Burkina Faso's Shea. Ghanaian supplies were tested. Synthetic substitutes were mixed in. But something was missing. The new formulas left greasy films absorbed poorly and lacked the balance of fatty acids that made shea butter unique. Consumers noticed. In Denver, a mid-tier beauty brand quietly admitted in a staff memo, "The formula feels off." Within weeks, complaints poured in. Online reviews were blunt. "This isn't real shea." Customers who had grown accustomed to quality now accused companies of cutting corners. Across boutique circles in New York and Los Angeles, a new phrase began to circulate: losing the soul of the brand. For small businesses, the hit was devastating. In Chicago, Clarissa Woodson stared at empty shelves. 3 months now, no Shea again. She whispered, her voice heavy with resignation. In Miami, a skincare founder confessed she was taping shipping boxes by hand to save on costs. Margins vanished. Rent loomed. Staff were let go. Across Brooklyn and Los Angeles, stores shuttered one after another. The tariff designed to pressure Burkina Faso was bleeding American entrepreneurs instead. The ripple extended beyond the United States. In Europe, which commanded more than 30% of the global shea butter market, procurement offices reported sudden shortages. The London Shea Futures Index spiked by 11% as traders scrambled to hedge against collapsing supply. Analysts in Frankfurt and Paris warned of rising costs in both cosmetics and food applications, for Shea had recently been approved by the U.S. FDA for use in confectionery and processed goods. Meanwhile, in Lagos and Accra, exporters hesitated. Contracts froze. Traders feared being swept into the wake of Washington's decision. If they can do it to Burkina, who is next? One Nigerian buyer asked. By early August, haulage statistics painted the picture in stark numbers. In Burkina Faso, volumes had fallen by nearly a third. But the impact was not contained. Across West Africa, regional exports stalled, and neighboring economies braced for turbulence. Shea butter, long dismissed as a niche commodity, had become a trigger for instability stretching across continents. And in Asia, the consequences were studied with sharp attention. Market analysts in Mumbai debated the risks of relying on Western buyers. In Dubai, trade forums buzzed with speculation about new corridors of commerce. Chinese investors watching carefully recognized what Washington had overlooked: disruption creates opportunity. The silence from Washington remained. No apology, no explanation. Only vague statements of national security and realignment. Yet the effects were plain for all to see. By branding Shea as expendable, America had undermined its own brands, alienated its small businesses, and destabilized an industry valued at more than $2.5 billion in 2025. In the corridors of global finance, the questions grew louder. Was this policy or was this sabotage? Who truly bore the cost? For in Ouagadougou, women waited under neem trees, uncertain of tomorrow's meal. But in Chicago and Miami, entrepreneurs sat in empty stores, counting losses they had never anticipated. What Washington had framed as control now looked more like carelessness. What was intended to bend a nation now threatened to break trust across markets. And while policymakers held their silence, Captain Ibrahim, watching from his midnight desk in the palace, prepared to answer not just for Burkina Faso, but for every African nation whose labor had been dismissed as dispensable. The world was learning a lesson Washington had not calculated. Shea butter was not a filler. It was not a niche. It was leverage. And the hands that cracked the nuts in Burkina Faso were suddenly holding a power the world had never truly respected. Inside the midnight halls of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim did not pace with fear. He studied maps. He reviewed corridors. He summoned his trade council and regional unions with a steady hand. To the decree from Washington, he gave a name unclouded by diplomacy. "This is not trade," he said. "This is economic warfare." Those words were not shouted in anger. They were spoken with the calm resolve of a soldier who had seen battles before. And in a nation accustomed to centuries of silence, they landed like thunder. Radio stations repeated them. Newspapers printed them in bold. Across villages and ministries, the message was clear: Burkina Faso would not beg. On August 2nd, just one day after the tariff, Traoré gathered agricultural unions in Ouagadougou. Before cameras and microphones, he declared an emergency program for local cooperatives. "They will not break us by starving our people," he said, his voice steady. Women listening in Kaya wiped tears from their eyes. In Bobo Dioulasso, drivers clapped their hands against their cabs. The phrase traveled faster than shipments ever had. And then the counterpunch. On August 4th, at precisely 10:17 in the morning, China's Ministry of Commerce issued official import licenses for 128 companies to purchase directly from Burkina Faso. The deal was sweeping 5 years, no quotas, no hidden conditions. Direct rail access, priority refining rights, no handouts, no debt, only trade. In the National Palace, Traoré traced his finger across the map. He slid past the old Atlantic routes, once dominated by Europe and America, and stopped at the port of Guangzhou. "This," he said, "is no longer theory. This is our new axis." The contract was worth $2.1 billion, but more than money, it carried dignity. For the first time, clauses mandated that Shea would not leave Burkina Faso raw. Processing facilities would be built in partnership. Technology would be transferred. Solar dryers, logistics grants, and training programs were signed, obligations, not favors. Women who had once cracked nuts barefoot would now read shipping manifests, operate machinery, and negotiate with buyers in Mandarin. It was a blueprint hidden inside a trade deal. While Washington sought to weaken a small nation, Traoré turned that pressure into policy. He called it the first mile principle that sovereignty begins where labor begins. No longer would Burkina Faso export its identity for pennies, only to import it back in luxury packaging. The world noticed. In Nairobi, headlines read, "Burkina Faso turns tariff into triumph." In Mumbai, analysts debated the long-term implications for commodity markets. In Lagos, traders asked whether cocoa could follow the Shea model. And in Beijing, 3 new refinery projects broke ground within a week. Shenzhen, Tianjin, Nanjing, each promising jobs, investment, and a reorientation of supply chains. Inside Burkina Faso, the mood shifted from despair to determination. In the hills of Kenedougou, women danced outside their cooperatives. "It means we work tomorrow," said Ayo, adjusting her headscarf. "And maybe next year." In Ouagadougou, students painted murals on concrete walls, from soil to sovereignty. This was not celebration without substance. Traoré worked through the nights reviewing corridor repairs, demanding audits of every contract, banning offshore arbitration. and insisting that cooperatives receive royalties from every exported unit, a global first. His governance was not rhetoric, it was infrastructure. Across Africa, a quiet question began to stir. If Burkina Faso could pivot, why not us? Could cocoa in Ghana, coffee in Ethiopia, cotton in Mali be reimagined not as raw exports, but as sovereign leverage? Traoré had not merely responded to a tariff. He had opened a doctrine, a way of seeing Africa not as the world's supplier, but as its equal. And to those watching from Washington, it was clear the captain had not bent, and he had not broken. He had pivoted, and in that pivot, the balance of power shifted. If you believe Africa's strength is God-given, let the comments say Amen. What began as butter now carried the weight of a banner. In the hands of Captain Ibrahim, Shea was no longer a humble product of village cooperatives. It had become a doctrine, a philosophy, a line in the sand that said, Africa will not sell itself cheap any longer. For generations, Africa's wealth had been stripped in raw form cocoa shipped from Ghana cotton, hauled from Mali coffee taken from Ethiopia, all sent abroad unprocessed, all returning later in glossy packaging at 10 times the price. Economists called it a structural trap. Traoré called it economic servitude. The Shea deal with China broke that chain. For the first time, Burkina Faso insisted that processing happen at home. Clauses in the agreement mandated solar dryers, refinery construction, technology transfers, and training programs. Each ton of Shea would carry not just the stamp of export, but the stamp of sovereignty. Women who once cracked nuts barefoot now learned inventory management. Cooperative leaders began scanning shipping manifests on digital tablets. Mandarin lessons were offered in regional centers. The phrase, women's gold, once a poetic description of Shea, became literal policy. Each barrel carried royalties that flowed back to the cooperatives. For the first time in global trade, the hands at the bottom of the chain were guaranteed a share at the top. The cultural echo was immediate. In the markets of Ouagadougou Street, artists painted murals of women lifting barrels of butter into a rising sun. In Dar es Salaam, musicians released songs with choruses that proclaimed, Shea is ours. At independence festivals, poets recited verses that compared cracked shells to old wounds now healed through sovereignty. It was not only art. Education shifted too. The Ministry of Education introduced new curriculum modules on indigenous trade history. In one assignment, a 12-year-old girl wrote, Sovereignty smells like the butter my grandmother makes. Across Africa, whispers turned to debate. In Accra, radio hosts asked if cocoa could follow the Shea model. In Lagos fashion, entrepreneurs wondered if palm oil could be vertically integrated the same way. In Addis Ababa, diplomats studied the Burkina Faso deal line by line, considering whether Ethiopia's coffee exports could be leveraged not as charity, but as power. Globally, analysts recognized the seismic shift. The African Development Bank issued a report calling Shea a case study in rebalanced trade. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story with the headline, From Shea to Strategy, Africa's New Power Broker. Suddenly, Burkina Faso, once dismissed as landlocked and fragile, was being spoken of as a pioneer. The lesson was not lost on Europe and America. For decades, Western corporations had assumed unchallenged access to African commodities. Now contracts had to be negotiated on new terms. No longer would resources leave without processing. No longer would value be siphoned elsewhere. Burkina Faso was small, but its defiance redrew the map. Inside boardrooms in Paris and New York, executives whispered the same word with new weight, Burkina Faso. Not with dismissal, but with caution. Not as a supplier, but as a strategist. At the heart of it all was a simple but radical idea: raw no longer meant weak. Shea was no longer just butter. It was a symbol, a signal, a school of thought. The Shea Doctrine, as commentators began to call it, had moved from policy into philosophy, from commodity into culture. And in that transformation, a small nation had offered a blueprint for a continent. The Shea Doctrine did not stay confined within the borders of Burkina Faso. Like a flame carried from torch to torch, it spread across the continent, igniting questions, hopes, and strategies in nations long resigned to the same old patterns of dependency. In Ghana, cocoa farmers gathered under mango trees and debated the future. Could their beans shipped raw for centuries be roasted, processed, and branded at home? In Ethiopia, young entrepreneurs asked whether coffee, the pride of the highlands, could finally be exported not as green beans, but as finished blends commanding global respect. In Senegal, policymakers studied cashew oil refining, wondering if the Shea model could be adapted. What Captain Traoré had demonstrated was not magic, but method. Sovereignty, he argued, begins in the first mile where labor begins. If Africa controls the first mile and the last word, it controls the story. That principle resonated far beyond trade. It became a framework for politics, for education, for culture itself. At universities in Accra and Addis Ababa, professors began teaching the Shea case study in development economics. Business schools in Nairobi used it as a model for vertical integration. In Ouagadougou, a poster on the walls of the National Business School read, "We do not chase contracts. They come to us." Diplomats also took note. At the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Burkina Faso's delegation introduced a resolution to classify Shea as a strategic soft commodity. The motion passed with the support of 15 nations. Leaders began to see in Traoré's blueprint a pathway to greater bargaining power, not as fragmented suppliers, but as a collective front. Even cultural movements leaned into the shift. In Johannesburg, murals depicted African women lifting barrels of butter like trophies of independence. In Dar es Salaam, poets recited verses of sovereignty drawn from Shea. Musicians in Lagos released singles celebrating from soil to sovereignty. It was as if an old silence had cracked, and in its place a chorus rose. Globally, investors could not ignore it. In Jakarta, Indonesia's trade ministry opened talks with Burkina Faso about joint refining ventures for palm derivatives. In Tokyo, K-beauty startups praised the quality of Burkina Faso's butter signing contracts that bypassed old European middlemen. In Seoul, cosmetics companies labeled the product the gold of the global south. But perhaps the most profound transformation was psychological. For centuries, Africa had been told it lacked infrastructure, it lacked capacity, it lacked readiness. The Shea deal dismantled that myth, brick by brick. It proved that with vision, contracts, and courage, a small landlocked nation could not only survive, but lead. Still, Traoré did not allow triumphalism. He instructed his ministers to audit every deal, close loopholes, and ensure that contracts carried enforcement under African law. He banned the outsourcing of arbitration. "We will not export our justice," he said. In every clause, he placed the worker first, guaranteeing royalties for cooperatives, mandating local training, embedding dignity into policy. For the first time in modern trade history, sovereignty was not an abstract speech. It was written into invoices, contracts, and shipping schedules. And as Burkina Faso's butter flowed eastward, rebranded not as a raw extract, but as women's gold, the continent began to see itself differently. No longer begging for inclusion at someone else's table. No longer waiting for favors. Africa was building new tables, setting new terms, writing new doctrines. The Shea Doctrine was no longer about butter. It was about power, about the ability of a people to transform humiliation into leveraged dependency, into sovereignty. It was a blueprint not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa entire. The Shea Doctrine had redrawn maps and rewritten contracts, but it did not erase the storms gathering on the horizon. For every headline praising Burkina Faso's pivot, there was a countercurrent of pressure, diplomatic, economic, even covert, designed to bend the experiment back into submission. In Washington, trade officials insisted the tariffs were a matter of national security. Behind closed doors, frustration grew. American beauty brands complained of collapsing product lines. Small businesses lobbied Congress for relief. Yet few were willing to publicly admit the deeper truth that the decision had backfired, strengthening the very nation it was meant to weaken. Europe, too, felt the tremors. French envoys, long accustomed to preferential access, now found themselves negotiating as equals a position they had not faced in West Africa for decades. One French diplomat confessed privately, "We used to assume access. Now we must request it." That shift, though subtle, was seismic. But the challenges were real. Burkina Faso's infrastructure, though improving, remained fragile. The Doré-Tima corridor lifeline of the eastern pivot was still plagued with potholes and bottlenecks. Electricity grids strained under the pressure of new refineries. Delays at border checkpoints tested the patience of international buyers. For all the pride of sovereignty, the machinery of trade required relentless maintenance. Inside the presidential palace, Captain Ibrahim was under no illusions. He chaired midnight meetings on logistics, reviewed refinery timelines, and demanded regular audits. His message to ministers was clear: we cannot afford errors. Dignity must be matched by discipline. Then there was the question of retaliation. Would Washington double down with further sanctions? Would Europe quietly erect non-tariff barriers citing health or quality standards? Would global institutions long influenced by Western power find ways to slow Burkina Faso's rise? These were not hypothetical risks. They were strategies already whispered in boardrooms and embassies. Even within Africa, challenges emerged. Neighboring states inspired by Burkina Faso began considering their own verticalization models. But such shifts required political stability, financial investment, and unity. Without coordination, there was the danger of fragmentation, each country negotiating alone, vulnerable to divide-and-rule tactics. Yet amidst these uncertainties there was resilience. At the Yerba refinery manager Idrissa Bakuno welcomed 10 new workers in mid-August, most of them single mothers who had once faced unemployment. "Last month we thought we would close," he said. "Now we are training for exports to Guangdong." Across cooperatives, women adjusted to the new reality. No longer invisible suppliers, they were stakeholders in contracts, recipients of royalties, participants in decisions. In classrooms, children studied not only history, but possibility learning that Africa's resources could be leveraged with dignity, not dependency. And globally, conversations shifted. Could cocoa, coffee, cotton follow the Shea model? Could the Shea Doctrine evolve into an African doctrine, a framework where no raw material left the continent unprocessed? If achieved, it would mark the end of a 500-year cycle of extraction. Still, the road ahead was steep. To sustain its pivot, Burkina Faso would need investment in roads, ports, technology, and education. It would need allies across Africa, not only in Beijing. It would need to withstand pressure from powers unwilling to lose their grip. And above all, it would need time for doctrine to become durable, for vision to become system. For now, though, one truth was undeniable. What began with butter had become a battle for the soul of global trade. And in that battle, Burkina Faso had shown that even the smallest hands cracking nuts in dusty villages could shake empires. The question remained, could they hold the line? And if they did, would the rest of Africa follow? One faith, one people, one destiny. Comment amen if you stand with Africa. What began as a tariff ended as a tremor. A single decree from Washington sought to silence a nation, yet it awakened a doctrine that spread across an entire continent. Burkina Faso did not fold. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, it pivoted eastward, upward, inward, reclaiming dignity not as a dream, but as a daily practice. The Shea Doctrine turned butter into a banner. It reminded the world that sovereignty is not measured in slogans, but in contracts signed in roads, repaired in royalties, returned to the very hands that cracked the nuts. It showed Africa that raw does not mean weak, that landlocked does not mean locked out, and that even the smallest cooperative can carry the weight of strategy. And so the question now belongs to us all: if Burkina Faso can rewrite the rules of trade, why not cocoa in Ghana? Why not coffee in Ethiopia? Why not cotton, palm oil, or gold across the continent? If women in Ouagadougou can transform labor into leverage, why can't every village, every farmer, every worker in Africa do the same? This is more than a policy shift. It is a blueprint, a reminder that Africa need not beg for inclusion at someone else's table. It can build its own. And when it does, the world must come not as master, but as partner. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak. Subscribe because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Don't let silence erase our voice. Tonight we are all Burkina. Every comment is a reminder that we're still here, that justice still stands, and it cannot be erased. Because Africa is not just catching up, we are building our own systems from the smallest acts on our own terms. Thank you for standing with us here. We'll see you in the next chapter. A chapter they wanted hidden, but we will never let that happen.